Above the distractions of the earth, God sits enthroned. All things are open to His divine survey, and from His great and calm eternity, He orders that which His providence sees best. Last night, I made a remark, and that was that all medicine has a basis in an understanding of anatomy and physiology. That's the foundation of it all. And I just want you to picture for a moment two students going to school, sitting side by side, reading the same books. One is a Christian, the other is not. Now, the scriptures tell us that we are to get knowledge. Is that right? And so here we have two students filling their minds with knowledge, good knowledge. And it looks like they're, just going parallel, side by side. But then the Bible tells us to get something else along with that knowledge. And what is that? Before wisdom. Understanding. That's right, understanding. And when it comes to understanding, they start parting ways very, very rapidly until pretty soon they're heading in two different directions. Is that not right? And along with that understanding that we're to get, what was that other word? Wisdom. And to me, wisdom is simply being able to apply that knowledge that you now understand. And when it comes to a study of physiology, the Christian is not only going to understand that knowledge in a different way, but he is certainly going to apply it in a different way. As he studies about the human body, he is going to see the very laws of God written right in his physiology. He's going to understand them. He's going to be awed by them. And then he's going to want to do something. He's going to want to put that knowledge that he now understands, he's going to want to put it in practical application, which is going to be obedience to those laws that he sees. He's going to want to come in harmony with them. He's going to want to cooperate with heaven in this work of promoting health. From the Paulson collection, on page 22, it says, "A physician who has the moral courage to imperil his reputation in enlightening the understanding by plain facts, in showing the nature of disease and how to prevent it, and the dangerous practice of resorting to drugs, will have an uphill business. But he will live and let live. He will not use his powerful drug medication. And why? Because of the knowledge he has acquired by the studying of books." So he acquires this knowledge and he sees something different. He says, no, this human mechanism is just far too wonderful to be doing that type of thing to it. So our understanding is quite different. Now it's interesting that in the early days when we were setting up Loma Linda as a school to train physicians, the question was asked, how are we going to meet all the legalities of this? And the Lord simply answered by saying, be in a waiting, hopeful position. But how are we going to meet the legalities here? We're going to set this school up, and how are we going to license our physicians? How's this going to be? And the Lord said, be in a waiting, hopeful position. But we decided not to wait, and so we really don't know what the Lord had in mind. But I do believe that He had something in mind. I do believe that we would have been sort of in a field all of our own, gospel, medical, missionary evangelists, and that we would have been doing a tremendous work, except for the fact that we decided we wanted to be allopaths, and we wanted to practice medicine similar to that of the world. I read a statement last night from Manuscript Releases, Volume 3, page 305, speaking of allopathy, where the servant of the Lord said, "From the beginning to the present time, the results of allopathy have made a most objectionable showing. And I do not believe that's the route that the Lord wanted us to take. And again, from Desire of Ages, we read a little bit of this last night. But in the third paragraph here on page 824, it says that Christ had been the guide and teacher of ancient Israel. And he taught them that health is a reward of obedience to the laws of God. The great physician who healed the sick in Palestine had spoken to his people from the pillar of cloud, telling them what they must do and what God would do for them. If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, he said, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and will keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Christ gave to Israel definite instructions in regard to their habits of life, and he assured them, the Lord will take away from thee all sickness. When they fulfilled the conditions, the promise was verified to them, for the scripture reads, there was not one feeble person among their tribes. These lessons are for, guess who? U.S., us. There are conditions to be observed by all who would preserve health. All should learn what these conditions are. The Lord is not pleased with ignorance in regard to his laws, either natural or spiritual. We are to be workers together with God for the restoration of health to the body as well as to the soul. So we have a part to play here, apparently. And I believe that the Lord would have us play that part especially well, in light of the fact that we have such a great commission that he's given to us to go out there and teach all nations the wonderful truth of the three angels' message. A couple of statements I wanted to read last night, but I didn't have it with me. As we were going through these 8 natural remedies, there's one we didn't comment on too much, and that was rest. But one person stopped me and asked me about this last night. This is from Manuscript Releases, Volume 7, page 224. And it says that I know from the testimonies given me from time to time for brain workers that sleep is worth far more before than after midnight. 2 hours good sleep before 12 o'clock is worth more than 4 hours after 12 o'clock. Now, I found that to be true. And I know that I feel much better when I get to bed before midnight, by 10 o'clock, we'll say, and have a couple of good hours sleep before the clock strikes 12. It does really seem to have about, quadruple the effect as it does when you get it on the other side of that particular time. Well, we went through the 8 natural remedies last night, and then we went to the middle part of the board here, speaking of sickness and injury. And then we went to the far side of the board, speaking of treatment, how that when we do become sick or we do become injured, that we have a decision to make, another part of cooperation, and that is to choose a remedy. We looked at that bottom remedy and found out that nothing was sort of a bad remedy. It really doesn't get you too far. And that faith alone really isn't faith. That faith plus works equals true faith. So we left that alone. And then we moved up to mystic medicine, and that's where I left off. And I kind of felt good about that because that's the one part that I don't like talking about too much, because that seems to be the part where we get a lot of disagreement. I used to have a fellow that worked with me from time to time giving public health lectures, And I always let him talk on the subject of cheese, milk, and meat. And that kind of left me free to talk about other things that weren't quite so objectionable to the people. But I got my just returns one time. I was way over on the far side of Montana, about as far away as you can get in Montana before you get into the Dakotas. And I was in right smack dab in the middle of cattle country. And I had about 35, 40 Montanans coming to my meetings, and the night finally came when I had to talk about meat. And I told them, I said, now we're going to talk about a subject now that I'm sure, because many of them out there were cattle ranchers that were sitting in my very audience. And I says, I'm sure that this subject might trouble some of you, but at least I need to, to get it out just for your for benefit, something you can look at, something you can make decisions on. And I said, I sure hope that you folks have grown out of, hanging people and stuff like that, people you don't agree with. I hope you're not vigilantic anymore these days. And actually, they took it quite well. So, but in times past, in talking about this particular subject, I have run into much opposition. So remember when I talk about this, that this is, from my vantage point, okay, this is the way that I see it. I guess you could say that a lot of it is my opinion from the things that I have read, and you may have a differing opinion, and that's okay. That's okay. We can agree to disagree on some of these things. We left off last night talking about what branch of medicine was that? Homeopathy. And we read a few things on that. And we can move right up into things like iridology. A lot of our people get into that particular branch of science. All I have to say about it is that all I've read about it and studied about it, I can find no connection with physiology in iridology. And how do you tell something good from something bad? Sometimes it's a little bit difficult, but the premise that I have always went on is that it has to have a foundation in physiology. We have to be able to see something there, because the Lord says, well, we talked about last night how that even the laws of nature are not self-acting, that God has to make everything work, but God has chosen to work through basic laws that He has set up. And when you come across something that actually defies those laws, then you got to have maybe a little bit of problem with it. And iridology, without going into it in depth, does fall into that category, at least from my vantage point. Another area that seems to fall in that category to me, and that is foot reflexology. Now, I've had people talk to me about these things at great length, and I usually tell people that are very energetic about foot reflexology that I personally make a practice of trying at least to get about 3 miles of it every day. And I feel that's about the best way to get it, out there walking maybe on a rough surface, and does me a lot of good. I know, because the Lord says that walking exercises every organ of the body. And so that's how I get my foot reflexology. Going away from some of those things onto other subjects that our people sometimes tend to get into that really do not have a foundation in physiology are things like the gallbladder cure. I mean, how many have heard of the gallbladder cure? It's it's quite a remedy. Actually, what you do is you take a cup of olive oil and drink that down, and then on top of that you use quite a considerable amount of lemon juice, and sure enough, the next day in the commode you will find that you have expelled from your body small little pellets. about the size of the end of your little finger. They look very realistic. And, not being a scientist, when you see them, you say, ah, I have finally passed those gallstones, and oh, do I ever feel better for it. However, the truth of the matter is that you didn't even pass a single gallstone. What happened was that the olive oil and the lemon juice mixed with cholesterol from the bile actually formed a soapy composition, sort of the consistency of soap, a chemical consistency of soap. And you passed something similar to soap pellets. But it did not come from your gallbladder. And just a little bit of understanding of physiology, taking a look at the common bile duct that, that empties out there in the pancreas, and taking a look at the diameter of that bile duct, you'd have to realize that something as big as the end of your little finger coming through a tube that teensy-weensy small would be, well, that would be quite a feat. And it just doesn't happen, actually. So these are some of the things that that we have to look out for. And just because it's simple doesn't mean that it's actually a true remedy. We need to see if it fits in a solid physiological foundation. However, people will say, but it worked. It worked. Well, I do not deny that. I mean, I understand that many things that have no foundation in physiology work, or at least they seem to work. From Secular Messages, Book 2, it says that we need not be deceived. Wonderful scenes with which Satan will be closely connected will soon take place. God's Word declares that Satan will work miracles. He will make people sick, and then he will suddenly remove from them his satanic power. They will then be regarded as healed. These works of apparent healing will bring Seventh-day Adventists to the test. Many who have had great light will fail to walk in the light because they have not become one with Christ. So there's many things that really look like they work. I can remember one day I was in a house of a dear friend. He was an older fellow. He was a prospector. And I asked him one day, I said, I've always wanted to know what prospectors do. I mean, how do you look for gold? Where do you start? You just hear of something and go off that way? Or what gets you started? He says, well, he said, that's a secret that I do not like to share with too many people. And I said, oh, well, I'm your friend. You can share with me. I'm not going to be a gold miner, so you don't have to worry about that. He says, well, I will. I'll share it with you. And so I went into the bedroom, and he came out with a little white box. And he took the lid off the box, and it had cotton in it, and he took the cotton out, and underneath the cotton was a little piece of gold nugget with a tied to a fishing line. And that didn't look real impressive to me. I says, oh, what's this? He says, well, this is how I find gold. Oh, well, how do you find gold with that nugget there tied to some fishing line? He says, well, here's a gold nugget. He says, I'm going to go into the other room. He says, you hide it in this house anywhere you want. And he says, and tell me when you've hid it, and I'll come back out and find it. I said, okay. So I thought, now, where could I hide this? And so I hid it as far away from where he would, when he came back out, where he would be standing, as far away from that point as I possibly could. And so I hid it way back over in the corner, and I hid it under his rug. So you just couldn't see it at all. Well, he came out and he stood by me. He said, you've got it hid? I said, yes. He says, hid very good. I said, yeah, you'll never find it. And so he took out his fishing line and he held it up. He held it there for a while, and pretty soon it started this kind of thing. I said, oh, he's doing that. That's what I thought. And so he walked a little ways, and he stopped, and he let the thing get going again, and it, he just kept going, and he walked and walked and walked until he got right into the corner where I'd hid that gold nugget. And then he stopped, because he couldn't go any further. And he held it there, and it started going around in a circle. And he says, well, he says, right around here someplace. And he got down on his knees, and the closer he got to it, the bigger the circle got. And he says, well, it must be right here under the rug. And he took the rug back, and he took out the gold nugget, and he put it in my hand. And I said, wow. I said, that's really something. He says, he said, that's nothing. I said, what do you mean that's nothing? He says, I know guys that can do that over maps. I says, well, over maps. Yes, well, I knew where all that came from. Well, that always stuck in my mind, and on through the years, I had occasion to have Seventh-day Adventists come and show me the very same thing. Except it wasn't with gold. One person said I'd given them a gift of a bottle of, I believe it was vanilla extract, and it had come from Mexico, and they wanted to know if it had any chemicals in it, we don't want any mercury in this or any lead or anything like that. But they had a way of testing it, and they took out the same little box and took the cotton off it and a little piece of metal and on a piece of fishing line, and they'd wave it over the bottle. And they told me that they could not only tell if the bottle was contaminated, but they could tell how much of certain chemical substances were in the air itself, and they knew which days they could go outside and which days they couldn't. It's surprising, but I've come across these things time and time and time again, and it's too many to even begin to tell you about them all tonight. From the hydrogen peroxide cure to the ozone to the oxygen therapy to on and on and on and on and on. But I have to come back constantly to the Word of God, to the Spirit of prophecy, and there I do not see any of those kinds of things, actually. What I see is a very simple program, a program that causes us to reach out in faith and look to our Savior for the healing of our diseases or to continue to maintain our health. And all these other things, these apparatuses and these concoctions and these compounds and these mixtures, and when we have all these things, people then get their focus on those things and off of the Lord. I know because I get letters about this all the time. Letters and phone calls, and have you heard of this and have you heard of that? And I don't want to just turn my back on all of it, because the Lord does say that, there are a few simple herbs of the field that we can use and all that. But by no means does it seem to be a great, vast field. I mean, I would never get the idea that I would need to become an herbologist or anything like that from the few Spirit of Prophecy statements that I've read on the subject. Just a few things, just a few simple things. Well, not to take up a lot of time with that. Like I say, we could spend a lot of time on that, and I don't want to take up a lot of time on it. I would rather get to the next thing on the list there, which is drugs. Do you think the Spirit of Prophecy has anything to say on that subject? A few things. A few things. I'm not going to bother reading a lot of statements on it because there's just so many, and I know that you've read a lot of statements on the subject. And when you read statements to a lot of people, they say, well, that was in those days. They had dangerous drugs in those days. They had powerful drugs in those days. Well, let me tell you something. The drugs we have now make those things look like child's play. Kindergarten stuff. They didn't have powerful drugs in those days. Today we have powerful, powerful drugs. From Selected Messages, Book 2, page 281, it says, drug medication, as it is generally practiced, is a curse. Educate away from drugs. Use them less and less, and depend more upon hygienic agencies. Then nature will respond to God's physicians. pure air, pure water, proper exercise, a clear conscience. Those who persist in the use of tea, coffee, and flesh meats will feel the need of drugs. But many might recover without one grain of medicine. If they would obey the laws of health, drugs need seldom be used. Seldom. Now, there was a time in my life when I thought that, that was the only way it happened. When I would get a runny nose, well, that was certainly time to, take some kind of a nasal spray to dry that up. When I had a cough, well, that was certainly the time to take something to suppress the cough. When I had an itch, well, certainly it's time to put something on it to make it quit itching. Any symptom that appeared, I was of the opinion that I had to take something to counteract that symptom. That was, maintaining health. Well, the time finally came when I learned better than that, somewhere about the year 1976, I believe. And from that time till now, I haven't had to resort to the use of medication. And my children have grown up entirely without medication. And I have a boy now that's 17, and another one that's almost 15, and a little girl that's almost 11. And they've yet to have needed the need of a physician. In fact, they've never been to a doctor yet. And I hope that, continues to be the case. And even when they were just little toddlers, just learning how to speak, when they got a cold or something like that, children do pick up sometimes, they would say, hot half bath, cold water pour. They just knew that was the treatment. And now that they're older, anytime that they're ill, they immediately know that it's time to go on a simple diet, and it's time to use the bathtub, hot half baths, fomentations. When they have a little bit of gassy stomach or something, they themselves go reach for the charcoal. I mean, that's just what they've grown up with. That's really all they know. And the thought of doing anything else just hasn't ever dawned on them. But I do want to, paint a balanced picture here tonight. We don't want to go off into fanaticism. But let's first understand what a drug is. By definition, a drug is simply a foreign substance of a poisonous nature. That's the definition of a drug. Do you think that an herb could be a drug? Yes, it could. Because there's many herbs that are of a foreign substance and of a poisonous nature. In 4 Spiritual Gifts, page 134, this is what the servant of the Lord tells us. That's where I got that definition, a foreign substance of a poisonous nature. And over in the same book on page 140, she says that every poisonous preparation in the vegetable and mineral kingdoms taken into the system will leave its wretched influence. So that poisonous preparation might come from the vegetable kingdom, or it might come from the mineral kingdom, and would still constitute a drug, a foreign substance of a poisonous nature. Now, all drugs are more or less poisonous. It just depends on the extent that they interfere with the metabolic processes. And what a drug actually does, it actually poisons some part of the system. It poisons certain enzyme assembly lines, I guess you could say, or enzyme systems. And to put it in terms that we can understand, what we can handle, it's sort of like robbing from Peter to pay Paul. That's basically what drugs do. They rob from Peter to pay Paul. And sometimes robbing from Peter to pay Paul has been life-saving. So we can't discount that, but I think we still have to understand it in a proper way. We do need to understand that drugs actually never cure disease. sometimes people get the idea that life exists in little teeny white pills, that taking that pill somehow has some kind of essence or something in it that actually makes you well, but that's not the case. When we get well, it's always because of the work that God is doing in our behalf, and it's always through a natural process. It's not through really the assistance of the drug. Now, I'd like to read you a letter. This is a letter from a brother Teasdale, George Teasdale, and it was to Brother Delafield. He says, "I am sorry that I have no written communication from Sister White, but I certainly have a very decided oral communication with her on the use of quinine, also including other effective means to tell you. Early in this century, I was connected with a mission in Java in the West Indies. We were, all of us, 6 or 8, ardent health reformers, and were quite convinced that any attack of any kind of disease could be successfully combated by our health reform habits." And we're talking about some health reformers now, some people that were convinced in the natural remedies. "If not entirely resisted. We were mistaken, for 4 of us were down with malaria. My little boy of 12 was the first, and he died despite our most earnest and energetic efforts, according to our handbooks on the treatment of all diseases. We were dismayed, for others of our party began to sicken. We sought the Lord most earnestly and decided to administer quinine as a last resort, and as such, it was effective. Our lives were spared, and we recovered rapidly with no after effects as a result of our good health reform living, but not by continuing to take the medicine. A year or 2 later, I was in California on the way to a conference to be held in Tacoma Park. I went up to St. Helena to see Sister White and also Elder W.C. White, whom I first met in the USA, says that while he was attending college. I recounted to her our experience with malaria and other troubles of similar nature in tropical lands. She stated, most definitely, to take anything or resort to any method rather than let the person die, for if dead, they were beyond our reach. But if they can be helped in an emergency to survive, then by natural means, they can be nursed back to health." Now this next sentence is the most important of this whole letter. It says, "Certainly she impressed upon me that these foreign substances were not to be used as a means to avoid disease or to cure, but only as stimulants on an emergency, as a cut with a whip might stimulate a horse to get out of a rut, but cannot help him definitely with his load. Her advice has helped me and many others who have required help under adverse circumstances or conditions." How often in our lives do we need the cut of a whip? I would hope not very often. But that's the way it was conveyed to this individual, that drugs were like the cut of a whip on the back of a horse that helped him move out of the rut, pull the wagon out of the rut, stimulated him in the right direction, but in no ways could help him carry his load. Well, there are times in emergency situations, I believe, in automobile accidents, certain things like that, where a heavy stimulant may be just the thing to get your wagon out of a rut and get you headed in the right direction. But in no way is going to help you carry right on through. It does not have that kind of capabilities. You see, in making drugs, they have tried for years and years to make a drug rifle. A rifle is something you can aim at a small bullseye, and if it's a good rifle and the sights are good, well, you can hit a little teeny bullseye with that rifle. But when it comes to drugs, the best they've ever been able to produce is shotguns. And so it may hit the bullseye, but it could hit everything else around the bullseye and, the bushes and everything outside that you wouldn't want to necessarily hit. And that's basically the way that drugs affect us. They have many, many side effects. Now, after reading that letter, I need to read to you a second letter, because I think this perfectly balances the subject. This was written by Dr. Paulson. He wrote this in 1907, and it was quoted in the General Conference Bulletin. He says, naturally, quinine was considered just as indispensable in malaria as morphine was following certain surgical operations. We soon had an abundant opportunity to put our principles in regard to quinine to a practical test. It happened to be a malarial summer in Michigan. During the summer, something like 50 cases came to us in all ages and in all stages of the disease. Dr. Kress and I, who could not consistently reconcile the prevailing routine quinine program with some of the truths we had studied, determined we would discover for ourselves what God would help us to do in malarial cases without quinine. So here we have a couple of energetic health reformers, a couple of physicians, that said, you know, the quinine routine is really not consistent with what the Lord has been telling us over the years. So maybe there's another way to handle malaria rather than quinine. One member of our class was an enthusiastic advocate of quinine. It was mutually agreed that as the patients came in, one was to be assigned to this physician, the next one to Dr. Kress and myself, so alternating. As he was also a microscopic expert, having taken special training in blood work, every case, not only his but ours, was carefully checked up by himself by laboratory work, so there was no chance for guesswork. We carefully took the temperature every 15 minutes. As soon as there began to be the least rise of temperature, that was a notification to us that the chill was approaching. We at once put the patient into a hot blanket pack, which brought on profound perspiration, and thereby, if we hit it right, we would invariably prevent the chill. The patient would perspire for a time. We would take him out carefully, provided it was the alternate day variety. We gave tonic treatments, hot and cold. The following day, we again instituted the temperature-taking program. We invariably found that the rise in temperature was much delayed, showing that we were gaining the ascendancy. We would then go through the same program. Frequently, we did not have to do this the third time. The work had been done, and in a week or 10 days, the patient was fully restored to health. Sometimes we'd miss hitting it just right for several days, so there would be a delay. After the clinics were over, they did a comparison of the two clinics. The quinine patients, there was deafness that was irreparable on some, there was impaired mentality, and there were numerous other minor complications. On the blanket pack side, there was not one serious complication. He closes with this paragraph. He says, one day an old, feeble, broken-down man came in so loaded with malaria that it seemed he was on the brink of the grave. According to the rotation, he belonged to the quinine list. The doctor, after sizing up the situation, said he did not dare to undertake his case, so he was turned over to our list. I will never forget when Dr. Kress and I earnestly told the Lord that his principles were on the test, and pleaded with him to vindicate what he had said. We then took hold of the case. Within a week, the man was restored to health. Praise the Lord, he says. And so here we have a couple of health reformers, a couple of physicians that were not satisfied to just say, well, quinine works good enough, so we'll just stop right there and that'll be it. We'll just use quinine. No, those things were not consistent enough with what the Lord had said. Therefore, they went on to search and look for something better. And, you know, on through the years, for example, at Battle Creek Sanitarium, you know, back during the great influenza epidemics at the turn of the century, people were actually dying like flies. They were dying by the thousands. Those that were taking the drug of the day were dying. Those that were doing nothing were dying. But those that went to the Battle Creek Sanitarium lived. At the Battle Creek Sanitarium, they never lost one case of influenza during that whole epidemic. Not one case did they lose. So the Lord's methods are actually the best methods. And a good many times, they're not just a treatment. many times they are the treatment of choice for many ailments. It's just that it's so hard for us to put faith in simple things. I can remember one evening I got a phone call from a fellow that probably most of you know. Most of you probably know David Meyer. Got a phone call. This is a few years back. Got a phone call from him. It was a Friday afternoon, just about sundown, and I could barely make out his voice. He was saying, "Dave, Dave." I said, "Who is this?" He says, "Dave Meyer," he says. I said, "Well, what is wrong with you?" I said, "What's wrong with your voice?" He says, "Oh, I'm very sick, very, very, very sick. Can I come on and stay with you?" I said, "Sure, come on out." So he got to the house, and he says, told me that they wanted to cut his throat open, is what he told me. And I says, "Well, that's not a very good simple remedy, you know, the tincture of cold steel. So maybe there's something the Lord can do for you in the meantime." And they'd given him some antibiotics, told him they were very, very strong antibiotics, and he really didn't want to take those antibiotics. And he says, "Well, I want to give the Lord a chance to see what, you know, his remedies can do." So we sat him down, and we got out the flashlight and the tongue depressor, and we looked down his throat, and his throat was almost completely occluded. It was swollen, it was red, it was pussy, it was the most angry-looking thing you ever had seen. And his temperature was right on up there, you know, 103, 104. He was ill. So the first thing we did was we gave him a hot half bath. Then we filled his mouth with charcoal, and then we put on a heating compress, and then we sent him to bed. About 4 o'clock in the morning, he came into my bedroom, and he says, Dave, he says, "I think I'm worse." And so I got up, and I went out, I got my flashlight, and sure enough, it even looked worse than the night before, if that's a possibility. And I knew we had to do something aggressive. I felt the Lord wanted us to get aggressive with this. And I was nervous. You know, sometimes the Lord waits until we're right up against the wall, till we've exhausted all of our resources, till we don't know exactly what to do, till the only thing left is prayer. And we were doing that, and a phone call. And I called a physician at UC Pines, a dear friend of ours, Dr. Miller, got him out of bed. And I told him the situation. I says, I'm very afraid that this could turn into a systemic infection, get into his blood. And then I said, we'd really be in trouble. He says, yes, that's definitely a worry. He says, there's one thing you haven't done that I suggest you get right at. And he says, that is applying fomentations as hot as you can get right to that area, and do it aggressively for at least an hour, or as long as he can take it, you know. Put one off, rub it with ice, slap another one on, off, ice, you know, and just right at it. So we did. And after about an hour, poor David, he was saying, "Enough, enough." So we put a heating compress around his throat, filled his mouth full of charcoal again, and back to bed he went. Well, 8 o'clock in the morning, I got up, went out there, and he was sitting there in a chair with a big smile on his face from ear to ear. I says, "David, you look happy." He says, "I am very happy." And his voice was almost normal. And I said, "Well, how's your throat?" He says, "It's okay. It's great. I don't think there's a problem there anymore." So I got out my flashlight and I looked in there, and no, all the swelling had gone down, all the redness had went away. He had dinner with us that afternoon. Now, these are the kind of things that will instill your confidence in simple remedies, and the fact that God will add His blessing to those remedies if we will stretch our faith just a bit to believe that what He says is true. One other situation that we had, and I know some of you have heard about this situation, but there may be somebody here that hasn't, and that was with my sister-in-law. My brother called me one day, and he says, "Dave," he said, "my wife has cancer, And he says, and they tell me she's dying and that she doesn't have much time to live. He says, this is the situation. He says, do you think it's true? And my brother, he never calls me on the phone. And he's always thought I'm some kind of a nut. And, we've never had much of a relationship. He's 7 years older than me. And so here he is, not knowing what to do. And he calls me on the phone. And he says, is there any hope, is what he was asking me. And I says, well, Butch, I said, as long as there's a God in heaven, I says, which there is, I said, there's always hope. I says, we're saved by hope. And he says, well, this is the story. He says she had a tumor in her bowel, and that tumor metastasized to the liver, and the liver was fully involved. And when they went in and they took the tumor out, all the tissue around it was malignant, and they couldn't do anything about it. And the liver was fully involved. All the biopsies came back full of cancer. He said, they've given her 6 months to live. He said, there's 4 doctors on her case, and none of them have offered any hope. I says, well, bring her out. As soon as you can get her out of the hospital, bring her on out. Well, he must not have been totally convinced, because he went to the one physician that would sort of give him the time of day. It was a young physician. He was actually the surgeon that operated. And he says, listen, doctor, he says, I've got this harebrained brother, that thinks that these kind of things respond to natural diet and some of these natural things. He says, what do you think about this natural stuff? And this doctor, he said, well, I'll tell you something. He says, we have nothing for your wife. He says, we have nothing for her at all. And he says, I would be the last one in the world to tell you that maybe these natural things just might really be the cure for cancer. He said, because I'll be honest with you, he says, we don't have a cure for cancer. A good one. He said, if I was you, I'd go out and see your brother. He says, you don't have anything to lose. So that's what brought my brother out to my house. So when his wife came, we put her on a good vegetarian diet. She was not they're not Christians at all. Put her on a good vegetarian diet, got her off her meat and all those things, got her on a good walking program. We gave her extra things like carrot juice and lots of green leafy vegetables and grape juice at night and things that we knew were definite cancer fighters and tumor fighters. And we gave her a series of fever therapy baths and worked with her, pointing her to the great physician. Now, she hadn't been a Christian before that, but as we were sharing with her all of these things, she became a believer. And after a week, she said, I just can't believe that I'm dying. She says, I've never felt this good before in my life. And I said, well, that's good. Don't believe you're dying. I mean, that's kind of a morbid thing to want to believe in anyway. I says, just look to the Lord, put your trust in Him. I said, after all we can do is our part, and God's got to do His. I mean, He's the one that heals, so we just do our little part here, and He'll be doing His big part up there. Don't you worry about that. And so we went on. Well, 6 months later, almost to the day, she became ill again. And the same symptoms as she had the first time around happened to her the second time around. She couldn't keep anything down. She couldn't pass any stool. She was just having a terrible time. And I went out to see her and gave her everything that I knew in the natural remedy line for nausea. And everything was just kind of a short-term thing. And after listening to her symptoms, I was quite convinced in my own mind that she had an obstruction of the bowel. And that, I said, we can't really do anything for that because it's kind of a mechanical thing, When you get a kink in the line, somebody's got to go in there and take the kink out of the line. That's all there is to it. And so we talked to her about going back to this surgeon. Well, we had so alarmed her about drugs and radiation and all these kind of things that, that's about the last place in the whole wide world she wanted to go. And she said, I don't want to go. I says, well, I don't really think you have a choice. I said, we'll pray about it, and we'll pray for you, and the Lord will somehow open up the way. And He did. The x-ray machine actually broke down while she was there, and they couldn't get any pictures. And the doctor says, well, that's just routine stuff anyway. He says, I don't need any pictures to tell me that you've got a bowel obstruction. we're just going to take you into surgery and take care of it. So they took her into surgery and took care of it. As she was coming out of the anesthesia, the doctor was in the room, and he couldn't wait for her to wake up. He says, "Mary," and he says, all it was a kink in the line. He said adhesions had set in, and it blocked off the intestines, and all we did was, take the kink out, but he said, I had a chance to look around in there. He says, all that malignant tissue that I saw 6 months ago, he says, it's not there. And he says, and we took biopsies, and they're already back, and he says, they're all negative. He says, so all I can tell you to do is keep doing exactly what you're doing and just go back home and live a normal life and just forget all about cancer and all those kind of things and continue on like you're doing. Well, praise the Lord. I'll tell you, that just did something for me. I mean, for me, the Lord just, it's still in my heart that we're on the right track. That the things that He's told us are absolutely true, and we can count on it. All we have to do is be obedient and cooperate with Him in these lines. Well, you see, we've kind of moved right up the scale there. We just talked about surgery, so we can see that sometimes it is a necessary thing. And we've also talked about drugs in a way that there's something we need to stay away from, but they're not something we need to entirely rule out, because maybe an emergency situation might arise where we might need to be cut with a whip, and be stimulated in a direction. That's a possibility. Now, I had one lady one day stand up in the audience, and she was waving her hand back there, and I said, "Yes, what is it?" She was so enthusiastic about it, and she says, "That's wrong." I said, "What's wrong?" She says, "What you said about drugs." I said, "Well, I thought it was pretty balanced, what I said." And she says, "No." She says, "It's a sin to take them under any circumstances, under all circumstances." And I said, "Well, what would you do if you were," and I kind of painted the scenario of being in an automobile accident and all this. And she said, "Oh, I know what I would do." And I says, "Well, what is that?" She says, "I'd die." I mean, that's pretty hard to argue with that. I says, "Well, okay. That's fine. That's fine. However, after you're dead, there's not much anybody could do for you." Well, that brings us right up then to the very top of the list, which is simple remedies. And we'll be talking more about them tomorrow night. But remember, when we say simple remedies, we can't just say, oh, simple remedies, so that just opens up a big, huge, broad spectrum of things. Yeah, it really doesn't. There's only so many things that fall in the category of things that have a foundation in physiology. You see, because the way that a simple remedy works in God's plan is it works in harmony with the way our body works. It works in harmony with it. It doesn't work against it. Now, a drug, on the other hand, actually works against it. And it's the action of the body fighting against the drug that actually brings about the effects that we're looking for. It's treated as an intruder, and it reacts against the poison, and that sort of puts the physiology in a certain direction. Gets it headed in maybe a right direction, I guess we could say. But it's treated more like an intruder. Now, a simple remedy is not an intruder. It's something that works right in harmony with the physiology and assists the body in what it's already trying to do. So it's something that assists. It doesn't work contrary. Let me tell you about, I got 5 minutes, so I'll tell you one more story. This is a recent one. I was over in Australia, and a retired minister came out to the little missionary institute that I was teaching at. And the reason he came was simply because he wanted to go through some treatments. And he wanted to get on a proper diet. He wanted to see what he could do before he went under the knife or something. And he had cancer of the prostate gland. And he'd went to the Sydney Sanitarium there, and some of his friends, some physicians that were friends of his, had done the workup, and they says, well, you've got cancer and you've got it bad, and you're going to have to do something very soon. This is to the stage. It's life-threatening. It's in its final stages. And there's a couple of options that we could go. We could go with some surgery. We could go with some radiation. Several things that we could do. He says, well, one moment he says, could I get around to this maybe in a couple of months? And they says, well, you're really at a point you need to do something. Make it no more than a couple of months. He said, just do what you have to do, but get back here. He says, well, I want to try something natural first. And they kind of thought that was a waste of time, but they, humored him and says, well, do it, but don't take no more than 2 months. So he came down to the little missionary place, and we got him on a good diet. We got him on a good exercise program. He needed all that. He had been on a lousy diet, and he hadn't been getting much exercise, and that showed on him a bit. And so he got those aspects taken care of. And we gave him 2 treatments a day. We gave him fever therapy in the evening, a series of fever therapy treatments in the evening, and we gave him some hot and cold sitz baths in the morning. And we prayed fervently for this man. He became quite a dear friend of mine. You really make friends when you're ministering to their health needs. When you've got somebody in a tub, or you've got somebody you're giving fomentations to, it's really a time where the Lord really ties your hearts together. So we had many, many good conversations. And after I got back, I was so anxious to know what happened, because he was going to go back to the Sydney Sanitarium after a length of time went by and be rechecked. Well, the good news was, they says, well, isn't that strange? We can't find any problem there anymore. So I guess you won't have to do anything. We don't know why this is, but it's apparently gone now. So I guess you can just carry on with your life. These are the kind of things I love to hear. And these are the kind of things that I cannot believe that just the remedy alone accomplished that. Just the carrots, just the water, just the walking. There's just no way those things in and of themselves can accomplish those kind of things. It's God's, the virtue of the Lord that He puts there and works through them and makes them effective. Well, I can see we're out of time, so we'll take up right here tomorrow night, looking at some of these remedies and looking at how the body works in fighting disease.